In the grand theater of human interaction, we find ourselves constantly navigating the delicate balance between social acceptance and authentic self-expression. Society teaches us from an early age that politeness is virtue, that compliance ensures harmony, and that keeping others comfortable is the hallmark of good character. Yet beneath this veneer of civilized behavior lies a troubling truth: many of the behaviors we've been conditioned to see as polite are actually undermining our own strength and earning us the very disrespect we're trying to avoid. The irony is profound. In our desperate attempts to be liked, accepted, and seen as good people, we often engage in behaviors that signal weakness, uncertainty, and a lack of self-respect. These seemingly innocent social habits create a cascade effect, where our attempts to be considerate are interpreted as submission, our efforts to be agreeable are seen as lack of conviction, and our desire to avoid conflict is perceived as cowardice. This document explores the 7 most destructive socially polite behaviors that paradoxically lead to loss of respect, and how the process of destroying one's weak self becomes the foundation for unshakable inner strength. The man or woman who learns to identify and eliminate these behaviors doesn't just gain respect from others, they build something far more valuable, a fortress of self-respect that no external force can penetrate. Part 1: The 7 Pillars of Polite Self-Destruction. The apology addiction. Marcus had always been taught that apologizing was the mark of a good person. His mother had instilled in him the belief that saying sorry showed humility, consideration, and emotional intelligence. By his 30s, Marcus found himself apologizing for everything: for taking up space on the subway, for asking questions at work, for having opinions that differed from others, for his very existence in shared spaces. "Sorry, could I just squeeze by?" he would say when walking through a perfectly normal doorway. "Sorry, I know this might be a stupid question, but..." he would begin during important meetings. "Sorry for bothering you," he would preface emails to colleagues about legitimate work matters. The word sorry had become his social lubricant, his way of softening every interaction to avoid any possible friction. What Marcus didn't realize was that each unnecessary apology was a small act of self-diminishment. Every time he apologized for taking up space, asking questions, or expressing thoughts, he was sending a clear message: I don't believe I have the right to exist as I am. His colleagues began to see him as uncertain, lacking confidence, and fundamentally weak. His romantic relationships suffered as partners lost respect for someone who seemed to apologize for his very being. The apologetic person creates a psychological environment where others begin to question their competence and value. When someone constantly apologizes for normal human behavior, observers unconsciously start to think, maybe they really are doing something wrong. Maybe they really don't deserve the space they're taking up. The excessive apologist trains others to see them as lesser, as someone whose needs and wants are automatically secondary to everyone else's. True politeness involves apologizing when you've actually done something wrong, when you've caused harm, made a mistake, or violated someone's boundaries. But the apologetic person apologizes for existing, for having needs, for taking up space in the world. This behavior doesn't make them more likable, it makes them less respectable. The strong person understands the difference between accountability and self-flagellation. They apologize when necessary and stand firm when they've done nothing wrong. They take up their rightful space in the world without apology, ask questions without prefacing them with disclaimers about their stupidity, and express their thoughts without immediately undermining their own authority. The yes man syndrome. Sarah prided herself on being helpful, agreeable, and easy to work with. Throughout her career, she had built a reputation as someone who would say yes to any request, take on any project, and accommodate any demand on her time. She believed this made her valuable, indispensable, and well-liked. She said yes to weekend work when she had planned family time. She said yes to projects outside her expertise that set her up for failure. She said yes to social events she had no interest in attending. Her automatic response to any request was agreement, regardless of her capacity, interest, or the reasonableness of the ask. What Sarah discovered, much to her confusion and pain, was that her constant agreeability didn't make people respect her more, it made them respect her less. Colleagues began to see her as someone without boundaries, without her own priorities, and ultimately without substance. Her friends stopped consulting her about plans because they knew she would agree to anything, which made her input feel meaningless. Her family began to take her sacrifices for granted, assuming she would always be available to handle whatever crisis or inconvenience arose. The yes person creates a paradox of value. By making themselves available for everything, they make themselves valuable for nothing. When someone agrees to every request, their agreement loses meaning. Their yes becomes worthless because it's guaranteed. People begin to see them not as helpful, but as someone who lacks the discrimination to know what deserves their time and energy. Respect is built on the foundation of selectivity. When someone has clear boundaries about what they will and won't do, their agreement to help becomes meaningful. Their yes carries weight because it could have been a no. The person who says yes to everything signals that they have no priorities, no backbone, and no understanding of their own worth. The strong person understands that saying no to some things makes their yes more valuable. They have clear criteria for what deserves their time and energy. They're helpful to people and causes that matter to them, but they don't sacrifice their own well-being and priorities to accommodate every request. Their selectivity makes their agreement more precious and their support more meaningful. The conflict avoider's dilemma. David had learned early in life that conflict was dangerous, uncomfortable, and something to be avoided at all costs. He would change the subject when conversations became tense, agree with opinions he fundamentally disagreed with to keep the peace, and avoid addressing problems until they became catastrophic. He believed that maintaining harmony was more important than expressing his authentic thoughts and feelings. In his romantic relationships, David would let resentments build rather than address issues directly. At work, he would watch bad decisions being made without speaking up, hoping someone else would take on the uncomfortable task of dissent. In friendships, he would accommodate behavior that bothered him rather than risk the awkwardness of a difficult conversation. David's conflict avoidance created a pattern where problems festered, relationships remained superficial, and his own needs went unmet. More damaging to his social standing, people began to see him as someone without strong convictions, someone who couldn't be counted on to stand up for what was right. His attempts to keep everyone happy resulted in no one truly respecting him. The conflict avoider fails to understand that healthy conflict is the foundation of strong relationships. When someone consistently avoids difficult conversations, they signal that comfort is more important to them than truth, that harmony matters more than integrity. People lose respect for those who won't stand up for their beliefs, won't defend their boundaries, and won't engage in the difficult but necessary work of working through disagreements. Respect is earned through the willingness to engage in difficult conversations with grace and strength. The person who addresses conflicts directly, speaks their truth even when it's uncomfortable, and stands up for their values demonstrates the kind of backbone that commands respect. They show that they have principles worth defending and the courage to defend them. The strong person doesn't seek conflict, but they don't run from it either. They understand that avoiding difficult conversations doesn't make problems go away, it makes them worse. They're willing to be uncomfortable in service of truth, integrity, and authentic relationship. The self-deprecating comedian Jessica had discovered early that making fun of herself was a reliable way to get laughs and deflect attention from her insecurities. She would joke about her weight before anyone else could comment on it, make fun of her intelligence before anyone could question it, and highlight her failures before anyone could point them out. She believed that self-deprecating humor showed humility, relatability, and emotional intelligence. At work presentations, Jessica would begin by joking about how she probably didn't know what she was talking about. On dates, she would make fun of her appearance before her date had a chance to form an opinion. In social groups, she positioned herself as the lovable loser, the one who could be counted on to be the butt of the joke. What Jessica didn't realize was that her constant self-deprecation was programming others to see her the way she presented herself, as someone worthy of mockery, someone whose competence was questionable, someone who didn't take herself seriously and, therefore, shouldn't be taken seriously by others. Her attempts to be endearing through self-mockery were actually training people to disrespect her. The self-deprecating person creates a psychological permission structure for others to view them as lesser. When someone consistently points out their own flaws, failures, and shortcomings, observers begin to focus on those negatives rather than on the person's strengths and capabilities. The self-mocker becomes defined by the very things they're joking about. Humor is a powerful tool for connection, but self-deprecating humor is a double-edged sword that often cuts the wielder more than it charms the audience. True confidence expresses itself through humor that doesn't require self-sacrifice. The strong person can be funny without making themselves the victim of their own jokes. Respect is built on self-respect. The person who treats themselves with dignity teaches others to do the same. They can be humble without being self-destructive, funny without being self-sacrificing, and relatable without positioning themselves as inferior. The people-pleaser's exhaustion. Michael had built his entire identity around making other people happy. He would change his preferences to match whoever he was with, mirror other people's opinions to gain acceptance, and sacrifice his own needs to meet the wants of others. He believed that being liked was the highest achievement, that approval was the measure of his worth, and that making others comfortable was his primary responsibility. Michael would order food he didn't want when eating with others to avoid seeming difficult. He would express enthusiasm for activities that bored him to fit in with groups. He would change his political opinions, his taste in music, his hobbies, and even his values depending on who he was trying to impress. He was a chameleon, constantly shifting to blend into whatever social environment he found himself in. The exhausting irony of Michael's people-pleasing was that it didn't make people like him more, it made them trust him less. When someone has no consistent personality, no stable preferences, and no firm convictions, others begin to see them as inauthentic, unreliable, and fundamentally weak. The people-pleaser's attempts to be universally liked result in being genuinely respected by no one. People are drawn to authenticity, even when they disagree with it. They respect those who have the courage to be themselves, even when that self isn't universally appealing. The people-pleaser's shapeshifting nature makes them impossible to respect because there's no authentic self to respect. The strong person understands that trying to please everyone is a guaranteed way to please no one. They have clear preferences, stable values, and consistent personality traits that don't change based on their audience. They're willing to be disliked by some people in order to be genuinely respected by others. The excessive explainer Linda had developed the habit of over-explaining everything, her decisions, her preferences, her actions, her thoughts. She believed that providing extensive justification for her choices showed consideration for others and helped prevent misunderstandings. When she declined an invitation, she would provide a detailed explanation of why she couldn't attend. When she disagreed with someone, she would offer a lengthy justification for her different perspective. When she made any decision that might affect others, she would explain her reasoning at length. Linda's over-explaining came from a place of anxiety about being judged or misunderstood. She thought that if she could just provide enough context, enough reasoning, enough justification, people would see that her choices were valid and reasonable. What she didn't realize was that her excessive explanations were actually signaling insecurity, uncertainty, and a belief that she needed permission from others to make her own choices. The over-explainer sends the message that their decisions are open for debate, that their choices require validation from others, and that they don't trust their own judgment. When someone constantly justifies their actions, it suggests that they themselves aren't confident in those actions. People lose respect for those who seem to need approval for their every choice. Strong people make decisions and stand by them without feeling the need to convince others of their validity. They understand that not everyone will agree with their choices, and they're comfortable with that reality. They provide explanation when it's necessary for practical purposes, but they don't seek validation through justification. The person who can say, "I've decided not to attend," without a lengthy explanation about why demonstrates confidence in their decision-making ability. The person who can disagree without a defensive dissertation on their reasoning shows that they're comfortable with their own perspective. This self-assurance commands respect in a way that excessive explanation never can. The attention deflector Robert had learned to deflect compliments, minimize his achievements, and redirect attention away from himself whenever possible. When someone praised his work, he would immediately point out its flaws or credit others. When he accomplished something significant, he would downplay its importance or chalk it up to luck. When he received attention for his abilities, he would quickly change the subject or highlight someone else's superior performance. Robert believed that this behavior showed humility, gratitude, and appropriate modesty. He thought that accepting compliments was arrogant, that taking credit for achievements was self-centered, and that receiving attention was uncomfortable and inappropriate. He had internalized the message that good people make themselves small, that virtue requires self-minimization. What Robert didn't understand was that his constant deflection of positive attention was actually disrespectful to those trying to acknowledge him and damaging to his own reputation. When someone offers a compliment and it's deflected, the giver feels dismissed and the receiver appears insecure. When someone minimizes their achievements, observers begin to question whether those achievements were significant at all. The attention deflector creates a pattern where their actual value becomes unclear. If they won't accept recognition for their strengths and accomplishments, others begin to doubt whether those strengths and accomplishments exist. The person who consistently makes themselves small trains others to see them as small. True humility doesn't require self-diminishment. The strong person can accept compliments gracefully, acknowledge their achievements honestly, and receive attention with dignity. They understand that recognizing their own value doesn't diminish others, and that false modesty is actually a form of dishonesty. Part 2, The Psychology of Respect and the Price of Politeness. The 7 behaviors outlined above share common psychological roots that reveal why they're so destructive to one's social standing and self-respect. Understanding these underlying patterns is crucial for anyone seeking to break free from the trap of misguided politeness. The approval addiction. At the heart of these destructive behaviors lies an addiction to approval that runs deeper than most people realize. The person who apologizes excessively, agrees to everything, avoids conflict, makes fun of themselves, tries to please everyone, over-explains their choices, and deflects attention is fundamentally seeking validation from external sources. They have made other people's opinions of them more important than their own opinion of themselves. This approval addiction creates a psychological dependency that's as powerful as any chemical dependency. The approval addict needs their next fix of positive regard, acceptance, or validation to feel okay about themselves. They will sacrifice their own needs, values, and authenticity to maintain their supply of external approval. The tragedy of approval addiction is that it's ultimately self-defeating. The very behaviors used to gain approval actually result in loss of respect, which makes the person more desperate for approval, which leads to more approval-seeking behaviors, which results in even less respect. It's a downward spiral that continues until the person decides to break the cycle. Breaking approval addiction requires recognizing that external validation is ultimately unreliable and insufficient. Other people's opinions are based on incomplete information, personal biases, and their own psychological needs. Making their approval the measure of your worth is like building your house on quicksand. It will never provide the stability you're seeking. The path to freedom begins with developing internal validation systems. This means learning to approve of yourself based on your own values, standards, and judgments. It means making decisions based on what you believe is right rather than what others will think is right. It means finding your worth in your own character, efforts, and growth rather than in other people's opinions. The illusion of safety. Many of these polite behaviors are motivated by the illusion that they provide safety. The person who avoids conflict believes they're protecting themselves from confrontation. The person who agrees with everything thinks they're avoiding rejection. The person who over-explains imagines they're preventing misunderstanding and judgment. This safety is an illusion because these behaviors actually make the person more vulnerable, not less. The conflict avoider doesn't prevent problems. They allow them to grow until they become explosive. The people pleaser doesn't avoid rejection, they guarantee that no one will ever know the real them well enough to truly accept them. The over-explainer doesn't prevent judgment, they invite it by appearing insecure and uncertain. True safety comes from strength, not from accommodation. The person who can handle conflict doesn't need to avoid it. The person who is comfortable with their authentic self doesn't need universal approval. The person who trusts their own judgment doesn't need to constantly justify their decisions. Building genuine safety requires developing emotional resilience, self-confidence, and the ability to handle difficult situations with grace. It means becoming someone who can weather storms rather than someone who tries to prevent all weather from occurring. The paradox of respect. The central paradox these behaviors reveal is that respect cannot be earned through submission, accommodation, or self-diminishment. Respect is earned through strength, authenticity, and the demonstration of valuable qualities. The person who makes themselves small doesn't become more likable, they become less respectable. Respect is fundamentally about recognizing value, strength, and worth. When someone consistently signals that they have little value, strength, or worth, others naturally begin to see them that way. The behaviors intended to make others comfortable actually make others uncomfortable because they're witnessing someone's self-destruction. People are naturally drawn to strength, confidence, and authenticity. They want to associate with those who have clear values, strong boundaries, and the courage to be themselves. The person who demonstrates these qualities through their behavior earns respect naturally, without having to try to manipulate others into giving it to them. The pursuit of respect through strength and authenticity is not about being arrogant, aggressive, or inconsiderate. It's about being genuine, confident, and self-respecting. It's about treating yourself with the same dignity you want others to treat you with. The cost of inauthenticity. Each of these polite behaviors requires the person to be inauthentic in some way. The excessive apologizer denies their right to exist as they are. The yes person denies their own preferences and boundaries. The conflict avoider denies their true thoughts and feelings. The self-deprecator denies their value and worth. The people pleaser denies their authentic personality. The over-explainer denies their confidence in their own decisions. The attention deflector denies their achievements and abilities. This inauthenticity comes at a tremendous psychological cost. When someone consistently acts in ways that contradict their true nature, they create internal conflict, self-doubt, and a disconnection from their own identity. They lose touch with who they really are and what they really want. The cost extends beyond the individual to their relationships. Inauthentic behavior makes genuine connection impossible. When someone is constantly performing a role rather than being themselves, others can sense the artificiality even if they can't articulate it. The relationships formed through inauthentic behavior are necessarily superficial because they're based on a false presentation of self. True connection requires authenticity. People want to know and relate to the real you, not the version of you that you think they want to see. The person who has the courage to be authentic creates the possibility for genuine relationships based on truth rather than performance. The internal transformation required breaking free from these destructive patterns requires more than just changing behaviors, it requires a fundamental shift in how you see yourself and your place in the world. This internal transformation involves several key elements. First, it requires developing self-respect. You must learn to value yourself not based on other people's opinions, but based on your own character, efforts, and growth. Self-respect means treating yourself with the same kindness and consideration you would show to someone you care about. Second, it requires accepting responsibility for your own happiness and well-being. You cannot make other people responsible for how you feel about yourself. Your worth cannot be determined by external validation because external validation is unreliable and insufficient. Third, it requires developing emotional resilience. You must become someone who can handle disappointment, rejection, conflict, and criticism without being destroyed by them. This doesn't mean becoming callous or indifferent, it means developing the inner strength to weather life's inevitable difficulties. Fourth, it requires clarifying your values and priorities. You need to know what matters to you, what you stand for, and what you will and won't compromise on. Without clear values, you'll be blown around by every social wind that comes your way. Finally, it requires accepting that you cannot please everyone and that trying to do so will result in pleasing no one. You must be willing to be disliked by some people in order to be genuinely respected and loved by others. Part 3: The Destruction of the Weak Self and the Birth of Unshakable Strength. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the very foundations upon which external attacks depend. When someone has no weak self to target, the arrows of criticism, rejection, and hostility have no place to land. This destruction of the weak self is not about becoming hard or callous, it's about becoming so fundamentally solid that external forces cannot shake your foundation. Understanding the weak self is the collection of insecurities, fears, and false beliefs that make a person vulnerable to external manipulation and attack. It's the part of you that needs constant validation, that fears rejection more than dishonesty, that values comfort more than truth. The weak self is built on the foundation of external dependence. It requires other people's approval, acceptance, and validation to feel whole. This weak self manifests in the 7 behaviors we've examined: but its influence extends far beyond social politeness. The weak self is what makes someone stay in relationships that harm them because they fear being alone. It's what makes someone stay in jobs that crush their spirit because they fear taking risks. It's what makes someone live according to other people's expectations rather than their own values because they fear disapproval. The weak self is not the same as vulnerability or emotional sensitivity. Healthy vulnerability involves being open about your authentic feelings and experiences. Emotional sensitivity can be a tremendous strength when paired with inner solidity. The weak self, by contrast, is about dependence, fear, and the inability to stand on your own foundation. The weak self believes that survival depends on other people's good opinion. It operates from scarcity of love, approval, acceptance, and worth. It sees the world as a dangerous place where rejection, criticism, and conflict are threats to be avoided at all costs. It believes that accommodation and submission are the prices that must be paid for safety and belonging. The process of destroying the weak self is not a violent or self-destructive process, it's a process of conscious evolution and growth. It involves identifying the fears, beliefs, and patterns that keep you dependent on external validation and systematically replacing them with strength, wisdom, and self-reliance. The first step in this destruction is recognition. You must see clearly how the weak self operates in your life, how it influences your decisions, and how it keeps you trapped in patterns that ultimately harm you. This requires honest self-examination and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about your own behavior and motivations. Recognition must be followed by decision. You must decide that you're no longer willing to live at the mercy of your insecurities and fears. You must choose strength over comfort, authenticity over approval, and truth over temporary peace. This decision must be renewed daily because the weak self will constantly try to reassert itself. The actual destruction involves exposing the weak self to the very things it fears most. If your weak self fears disapproval, you must be willing to disappoint people when necessary. If it fears conflict, you must be willing to engage in difficult conversations. If it fears rejection, you must be willing to risk being turned away. This exposure doesn't mean seeking out these experiences for their own sake, it means not allowing the fear of them to control your behavior. As you repeatedly choose strength over weakness, authenticity over performance, and truth over comfort, the weak self begins to lose its power over you. The fears that once controlled your behavior lose their intensity. The need for external validation diminishes. The courage to be yourself grows stronger. Building the strong self as the weak self dies, the strong self emerges. The strong self is built on the foundation of self-respect, clear values, emotional resilience, and the ability to find your worth from within rather than from without. It doesn't need external validation because it has internal validation. It doesn't fear rejection because it would rather be rejected for who it is than accepted for who it isn't. The strong self has clear boundaries. It knows what it will and won't accept from others. It understands that saying no to some things makes your yes more meaningful. It recognizes that respect is earned through strength and authenticity, not through accommodation and submission. The strong self is emotionally resilient. It can handle criticism without being crushed, rejection without being destroyed, and conflict without falling apart. This resilience doesn't come from being hard or unfeeling, it comes from being so fundamentally solid that external storms cannot shake your foundation. The strong self has clear values and priorities. It knows what matters and what doesn't. It makes decisions based on what it believes is right rather than what others will think is right. It's willing to be unpopular when necessary to maintain its integrity. The strong self is authentic. It doesn't change its personality based on the audience. It doesn't say what people want to hear if it contradicts what it believes to be true. It presents itself honestly, without apology or explanation for its nature. Most importantly, the strong self is self-contained. Its happiness doesn't depend on other people's approval. Its worth doesn't fluctuate based on external circumstances. Its peace doesn't require other people's accommodation. It has found the source of strength within itself and no longer needs to draw it from external sources. The unshakable foundation. When the weak self has been destroyed and the strong self has been built, something remarkable happens: you become essentially unshakable. Not because you've become hard or insensitive, but because you've become so fundamentally solid that external attacks have nothing to grab onto. The person who doesn't need approval cannot be manipulated through the promise or withdrawal of approval. The person who has faced their fears cannot be controlled through threats. The person who knows their own worth cannot be diminished by others' opinions. The person who has clear values cannot be swayed by popular opinion or social pressure. This unshakability doesn't mean you become immune to all emotional pain or that you stop caring about others. It means that your fundamental sense of self, your core identity, and your basic worth are not dependent on external circumstances. You can be hurt, disappointed, or saddened by events and other people's actions, but these experiences don't threaten your basic foundation. The unshakable person can afford to be kind because their kindness doesn't come from weakness or need. They can be generous because their generosity doesn't come from desperation for approval. They can be loving because their love doesn't come from fear of abandonment. All their positive qualities come from strength rather than weakness, from abundance rather than scarcity. Living from strength. When you've destroyed the weak self and built the strong self, your entire approach to life changes. You no longer make decisions based on what others will think, you make them based on what you believe is right. You no longer try to avoid all discomfort, you're willing to be uncomfortable in service of your values and growth. You stop apologizing for your existence and start taking up your rightful space in the world. You stop agreeing with everything and start expressing your authentic thoughts and opinions. You stop avoiding conflict and start addressing problems directly. You stop making fun of yourself and start treating yourself with respect. You stop trying to please everyone and start being selective about where you invest your energy. You stop over-explaining your decisions and start trusting your own judgment. You stop deflecting compliments and start accepting recognition gracefully. These changes don't happen overnight, and they require constant vigilance. The weak self will try to reassert itself during times of stress, uncertainty, or vulnerability. But each time you choose strength over weakness, you reinforce the new pattern and weaken the old one. Living from strength also means accepting that not everyone will like you, and that this is not only okay but necessary. When you're being authentic, you'll naturally attract some people and repel others. This selectivity is healthy because it allows you to form genuine connections with those who appreciate your authentic self while filtering out those who would only accept a false version of you. The ripple effect: when you destroy your weak self and live from strength, the effects extend far beyond your own life. You become a model for others of what's possible when someone chooses authenticity over approval, strength over comfort, and truth over temporary peace. You give others permission to be strong by demonstrating that strength is possible. Your relationships improve because they're now based on truth rather than performance. People know where they stand with you because you're honest about your thoughts and feelings. They can trust you because you don't change your personality based on the situation. They respect you because you respect yourself. Your work improves because you're no longer holding back out of fear of criticism or judgment. You're willing to take risks, express ideas, and stand behind your contributions. You become more valuable because you're operating from your authentic strengths rather than trying to be what you think others want you to be. Your overall life satisfaction increases because you're living according to your own values and priorities rather than trying to meet everyone else's expectations. You experience the deep contentment that comes from being true to yourself and the respect that comes from others recognizing your strength and authenticity. The ultimate freedom: the man who destroys his weak self achieves the ultimate freedom, the freedom to be himself without apology, explanation, or fear. This freedom cannot be granted by others and cannot be taken away by others because it comes from within. It's not dependent on circumstances, other people's opinions, or external validation. This freedom allows for true service to others because it comes from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion, from love rather than fear. When you're no longer controlled by your own insecurities and fears, you can genuinely care about others' well-being without being driven by the need for their approval. The journey from weak self to strong self is not easy, but it's necessary for anyone who wants to live a life of authentic strength and genuine respect. It requires courage to face your fears, wisdom to see your patterns clearly, and persistence to keep choosing strength even when weakness feels easier. But, for those who make this journey, the reward is immeasurable: a life lived from the inside out rather than the outside in, relationships based on truth rather than performance, and a sense of self that cannot be shaken by external storms. This is the ultimate victory over the weak self and the birth of unshakable strength. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the very thing within himself that could be destroyed. He has become, in the truest sense, unshakable.